Good morning, everyone. 9,000 subscribers. I woke up to 9,000 subscribers. Thank you very much, sincerely. It means a lot to have so many people interested in the crazy stuff I do, making the world a louder place. As my teenage son informs me, I'm almost a real YouTuber. So, bucket list, almost unlocked. A real YouTuber. Thanks, kid. Well, lest anyone think that this internet celebrity status, ahem, has gone to my head. This is a hot rod DeVille 2x12 that just about kicked my butt. And as many of my fellow techs have expressed to me in various forms of polite and not so polite language, it's often the simplest ones that drive you nuts. Some backstory on this amp. In 2009, I believe, let me check that. Not 2009. 2019. Sorry. Those decades really blend together. Pretty much, I was a kid, I was in college, I was meeting girls. OK Computer came out, and now it's today. And I'm old, and it's been a couple weeks since I was not, and it's very strange. Some of you will relate, and others will think I'm, as someone accused me the other day, of being a bitter old man. I even got my first legitimate OK boomer from a kid. I'm actually 51. I'm not a boomer, and I'm not quite old and decrepit yet, and I'm not set in my ways. And yes, idiot, I know the difference between a Zinke Supro and a real Supro. But anyway, so this amp came in 2009, and it had been butchered. A previous tech had attempted to fix things in it and had damaged traces. You can see some jumper wires I put in here, both bus wire and a little 22 gauge Teflon coated jumper there. Had a lot of bad resistors in the preamp. I changed those out, 1 watt carbon films. Had bad voltage balance resistors in the power supply. I changed those out. That's a very common thing to fail in most of the hot rods, as well as the plate resistors in the phase inverter. The IC caps were leaking everywhere. I changed those out. The plastic input jacks were shot. Got some switchcrafts, and all was well. Then this amp came back again later, and the original speakers had bad voice coils. And I talked to the owner. We put in these warehouse veteran 30s, which are very similar to a vintage 30, only without a spike around 1-2K that can be a little comb filtery when overdriven. Just a little more balanced sound, but very familiar if you like vintage 30s. And I mention all this because the symptom the amp had when it first came in, and it had bad filter caps. I forgot to mention I had bad Zeners. I changed those out. So when the amp first came in, it had bad solder joints in the phase inverter, and it had bad filter caps, and it had failing resistors. The symptom the amp had was really unpleasant, distorted sounds, especially on note decay. And when it came in a year later, because the original speakers the voice coils were shot, even though there was a different cause of the problem, the symptom was the same. To the owner's perspective, he had me do all this work, and then later it made the exact same sound as if I had not fixed the original problem. And the speakers were in October of 2020. So a year and a half after I'd done this work, it came back with the same symptom. It was bad speakers that time. And now it's come back in, and it has been about another year and a half almost, from October of 2020 to March of 2022. And from the owner's perspective, it was the same symptoms, really awful sounds. This time, though, in addition to the distorted sounds when you played, especially on note decays or any hard transients or certain frequencies, which told me that the whole thing was vibrating from the speakers, there was a terrible, terrible sound when I put it in and out of standby. It was, I'll not do it very loud, but it was like sound. Only imagine that at 110 dB. And if you're working on an amp like this, it was right in your face. So this time I found that there were multiple other failures, which were not in things I had fixed the previous time, now almost 4 years ago, certainly 3 years ago. They were not problems at the time, but they became problems. So let me move the camera closer so you can see the problem areas. All right, first, let's see if you can see it. The plate connection on this power tube, they all had big gobs of solder on them from the previous tech. And this tube was making a lot of noise if I tapped in this area or touched the tube. And I removed the solder from pins 3, 4, and 5, which are the signal and voltage critical components on a 6L6. And I found that beneath the big pool of solder on pin 3, the pad on the board was not connected fully to the trace on the board. It was hidden by the big dome of solder. So the pin of the socket was soldered to the pad on the board, but there was not a very reliable connection from that pad to the trace going to over here where there's a quick connect, which is where the primary connects on the underside. So I put in some 20 gauge bus wire from that tube pin to this quick connect, and then I reflowed that. That solved that issue. The next issue I found was that the guy previous to me, or perhaps these were factory, this is an early hot rod DeVille 2x12, had these 2-watt 470 ohm screen grid resistors. They were mounted beneath the board, right up against the board. And I think it might be both bad solder from the previous guy and just the heat dissipated by these little 2 watts right up against the board had just nuked those solder joints for the screen grids. So I put in new 5-watt 1K screen grids mounted on top away from the more direct heat of the tube with some airflow so they will run cooler. And I verified all the connections, and I reflowed the critical 3, 4, 5 pin connections on the output tubes. And that took care of the sound coming in and out of standby. And that made the tubes no longer make awful noises if I rattled them. There was still a ringing sound on certain notes. And at some points, the amp would begin to motorboat unless I touched one of the 2 output tubes. I didn't touch them here where the plate is. I would have burned the hell out of myself. I touched the bottoms, which you can't see here, and only briefly. Sometimes I'll get an oven mitt for such things, but if I touch this tube, the vibrations would dampen and the motorboating would stop. But this tube had become really microphonic. So he's got a brand new pair of Sovtech 5881 WXTs, which are the same thing as their 6L6 WXTs. They're just branded differently. It's a fine quality 6L6. In 2022, it's one of the best ones that are available on the market right now. And I set the bias at the factory 60 millivolts. And all seemed to be well, but I was giving it a little bit of a play. And I noticed that if I was playing really loud on really big low notes on the low E string, sometimes I'd hear just something. And it turns out that the original speaker jack here just had no mechanical tension left. It just would not grab this. I could just touch this jack and it would fall out. So it's got a new Switchcraft speaker jack, and when it's out, it's grounded properly because the shunt is making contact with the tip again. And when it's in place, it's rock solid now. It's making real good contact. And on the first trip here, I didn't didn't mention it before, but I also replaced the molded plastic speaker. I guess I did this probably when I did the speakers. I put in a Neutrik plug with some real speaker cable going to the new speakers. So, from the owner's perspective, he brought it to me 3 years ago because it was making nasty noises, particularly if you played hard or on the decay. Then 2 years ago, it came back for the same problem. And now it's come back for the same problem. So from the owner's perspective, he keeps bringing it to this guy, and it keeps developing the same problem because it's the same symptoms. And from a tech's perspective, they are all overlapping symptoms of different problems. And it's one of the hardest things to convey to an owner, where I'm not covering my ass and I'm not making excuses and I'm not saying, no, really, man, blah, 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 just give me some more money, you know. And there are techs out there who will say, this amp's got 4 problems, let me fix 3 of them, and then the amp will come back next year and I'll fix that 4th one there and get a whole new bench fee out of it. I'm not one of those. I want people to, you know, bring me a hot rod DeVille and I fix it, and if I see them again, it's for a different amp or it's socially. I don't really want to keep the same bench amp coming back to my bench over and over again. It doesn't make for a good reputation, and it doesn't do anything for one's pride. So I'm going to now hook this up with a real mic and do a playing test, make sure that I haven't missed anything. And you know, it's odd to me that very few people watch the playing tests. People love the, hey, this amp caught on fire, can we fix it videos? And then to a lesser degree, they might like the second video and watch the second video where the fix is done. And then I do the final thing saying, hey, and here's what it sounds like. I get a disproportionate decline in views of those last videos. And it's odd to me that if I'm interested in, hey, this Blues Junior caught on fire, I'd also want to see what the fix was and what it sounded like after all that. But, you know, maybe I'm coming to YouTube for different reasons than others. All right, let me hook this up and we'll see what it sounds like. Before I play, I want to mention 2 things. Number 1, I have the reverb up a little bit more than I normally would because I want to make sure there's nothing weird happening in that reverb circuit, because that's part of the low voltage power supply that can be a little bit troublesome on these models. Second of all, I should have put this in the previous part of the video, but given how much work I did on this amp, even though it was almost 3 years ago that I did the bulk of it, and given that from the owner's perspective, the symptoms are the same, I'm not charging for this service today. I'm just going to charge him for the new pair of 6L6s, but no labor. And I want to stress that that is my call to make in this situation. Normally, I have a 90-day no questions asked period. But if I do extensive work to an amp and it comes back a year later with issues, I'll often waive things or give discounts. 2 years later, when I know that the causes are totally separate, I'd be wholly justified in charging him for a whole new service. But I'd rather just be nice when I can afford to be. But it's when I choose to do things like that. So let's start with just some basic cleans. going to turn down the reverb and turn up the gain. That's with the volume just about noon. Before was the volume about 9:30. Right here is much louder than most people are allowed to play live these days. Let's see how the overdrive channel sounds. Need a volume pedal. Let's see how the more setting sounds. The feedback's because I'm like 6 feet and these are very lively pickups, but I'd say this amp sounds pretty healthy. Let me go back to the clean just to make sure I didn't miss anything. I can't play. Just showing off that I got the trim to work and stay in tune. More on that later. While the amp still sounds like a Hot Rod DeVille, and it's real MIDI and bassy, I think the Deluxe actually sounds better, but that's subjective. I can say that this sounds like a very healthy example of a Hot Rod DeVille, and that's all I need to worry about today. So I'm glad to put this amp hopefully behind me, and maybe if it comes back, it'll be more than 2 years from now. But I think the owner will be happy to only have a bill for a pair of 6 L6s. We do what we can.